All right, welcome back. This week, moving on to chapter 21, which is periodization. So, hopefully, this is going to sound very familiar since Coaching 345, although officially titled Program Design, was basically the textbook, or used basically the textbook on periodization. So, we covered this pretty extensively in that class. It was basically all of the subject matter for Coaching 345. So, hopefully, this will be a nice review for you. And maybe you'll recall that one of my complaints in that class was that different authors covering periodization use different terminology. So we use the Bompa and Half book. This particular chapter is written by Half. There's also Mike Stone and I think his first name is Brian Garhammer. And then a few other authors. And so for each of those, the terminology changes just a little bit. So some of this terminology that you're going to see is similar to but slightly different than what we covered in 345 using the Bompa book. So I'll try to point out where those points are, but just something to be aware of. There's no like one universal set of terms with periodization. There are a lot of similarities, but like I said, there's no one universal set that everybody uses. So Half uses slightly different terminology than Bompa did in that textbook. And then, Stone and Garhammer use slightly different terminology as well. So anyway, I'll point those out as we go along. But as you know, periodization involves dividing the training year into multiple periods. So the idea is that we vary the training load, which is a term we talked about a lot in that class. So training load includes a number of variables like the training frequency, the intensity, the volume, those kinds of things. And we're going to manipulate the training load throughout the year with an eye toward developing very specific things. So maybe we're trying to improve their tactical abilities. So maybe they're better at, understanding where the defense is going to be, how they're going to adjust, those kinds of things. Maybe we're working more on their technical abilities in the sport, making them a more accurate server, more accurate shooter, those kinds of things. And so to alter those things, we're going to manipulate a variety of different training variables. So like I said, we can manipulate the frequency of the tactical or technical training, the intensity of that training. We can try to manipulate different physiological variables. We can try to make them, larger, so add muscle mass. We can try to make them stronger, faster, more powerful, etc. So what we're going to do from a periodization standpoint then is to divide the training year into multiple periods, typically 4. And then within each of those periods, we're going to have specific goals. So for example, during the general preparatory phase, we're going to do things like have them lift light to moderate weights, relatively high volume, so low to moderate intensity, moderate to high volume. And in doing that, we're going to try to, for a football athlete, for example, we're going to try to generate some muscle hypertrophy. So we're going to try to add some lean mass to them going into the preseason and then the main part of their competitive season. And then during the main part of the competitive season, we try to hang on to the gains that they've made. During the postseason or the transition phase, we're going to have them try to engage in some active recovery so they can gain or have some physical rest, mental rest, and then may rehabilitate any injuries if they have them. So that's the idea of periodization, dividing the training year into different periods with different goals for each period. And then within each of those periods, we're going to adjust the training load by altering volume, intensity, frequency of training. Again, the type of training, whether it's tactical, technical, etc. All right. So this is also something that we covered in 345. So what this is, the way this chapter is laid out, there are 3 concepts related to periodization, or 3 theories related to periodization on which the periodization theory relies. So the first one is this general adaptation syndrome, first coined by Selye in 1956. It wasn't intended to be used as a model for physical training, but it kind of underlies or undergirds all of the theory behind periodization. And so what this, and this is the little graphic for it down here. So what this says is we've got this person, this is their current performance level, and then we have them undergo some sort of a workout. So we have them do a bunch of squats and deadlifts, etc. And so the acute response that they get to that, so things like muscle soreness and fatigue and stiffness and all that kind of stuff, that falls under the category of the alarm phase, and so we're going to see that their performance level drops off. So obviously, if you are sore, if you're stiff, if your intramuscular stores of glycogen are depleted, your performance is going to drop. You're not going to be able to produce as much strength, as much power, etc. But then if we let them rest and recover, then that's the resistance phase. So let's say they squat and deadlift today, and then over the course of the next 2 days, they don't really do much. Maybe they do some light bike riding and some foam rolling and that kind of thing. So during those 2 rest days, they're going to rebuild the damaged muscle. So they're going to repair the sarcolemma of the muscle cells. They're going to add additional collagen in the endomysium. They're going to make new actins and new myosins, those kinds of things. So the muscle will recover. And then after that initial stimulus, the muscle actually recovers more, or to be stronger than it was prior to that initial insult. And so that is now this supercompensation phase up here. So they can now perform at a higher level than they could before that workout. So you cause alarm by damaging the muscle rebuilds, and after the rebuilding process, if we allow them to recover sufficiently, now they're going to have a new higher performance level. Down here, exhaustion is basically if we have them go through that one workout and then we pile on another one and another one, their performance is going to drop off quite a bit and they're never going to have enough time to recover, and so then that's when we get overtraining. Initially overreaching, and then that's followed by overtraining. And so, as discussed in the other class, that's something that can lead to the end of an athletic career. So, obviously, we don't want that. We want introduce some fatigue and some damage to the muscle, damage to the not damage to the cardiovascular system per se, but you got to challenge the heart to cause it to become more elastic, to cause it to become stronger, those kinds of things. And then we see an adaptive response, and now they're a better athlete. They're fitter, higher power outputs, better strength, etc. So that's general adaptation syndrome. The next one, stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation theory, is basically the same thing. I guess the primary difference here is that it does a better job of taking account of the overall magnitude of the workload, as you can see here. And so if we keep accumulating fatigue because we keep having to work out and they never get to recover, that affects how long recovery is going to take. So that's kind of the key difference between this theory and the general adaptation syndrome, is that it takes into account the magnitude of the workload and then the total accumulation of fatigue, versus this one, there's no accounting for that. It's basically kind of just this theoretical model of fatigue, recovery, supercompensation. But otherwise, they're basically the same idea. So involution, just as an aside, hopefully that's a term you're familiar with, means the same thing as detraining. And so you see detraining up here. So involution is that they lose the gains that they've made because they've stopped training or because they haven't trained at a sufficient load. So typically the lack of load there is a lack of intensity, but potentially could also be a combination of intensity and volume. And then the last one is the most complicated of the three, and I think unnecessarily so. So the fitness fatigue paradigm, what it basically says is that performance, or preparedness, is at the intersection of fitness and fatigue. So fitness meaning things like your aerobic capacity, your muscular strength, muscular power, etc. Fatigue, obviously, how tired they are, both physically and mentally. And so the graphic for this, which is where I think it gets unnecessarily complicated. So with our training stimulus, their fitness is going to improve, and there's going to be an overlap between fitness and fatigue. And so at that overlap, that's where you have their highest level of preparedness. So for example, if you have somebody undergo really high intensity, high volume training, their fitness is going to improve, right? They're going to have improved aerobic capacity, improved lactate threshold for an endurance athlete. But because of that high intensity, high volume, their fatigue is going to increase quite a bit. So even though their fitness has improved, their level of fatigue has increased quite a bit as well, and so that actually results in an overall reduction in preparedness. If we go the other way, rather than having this huge load to spur fitness but also increases fatigue, if we go the other way, we say, okay, well, we don't want them to get too fatigued, and so we're not going to have them really train all that hard so that they won't be very fatigued either mentally or physically. That should help improve their preparedness. But if they don't train very hard, or they don't train sufficiently intensely, or don't have sufficient loading, then their fitness will suffer, right? They won't have improvements in their VO2 max, they won't have improvements in their lactate threshold, muscular strength, whatever you want to measure. So because the training stimulus is not high enough, then even though they have a low level of fatigue, because you're not really training that hard, their fitness remains at a pretty low level, and so their preparedness then remains at a low level. So the idea is that we have this intersection again where we train them hard enough that we improve their fitness, but also we manipulate the training in such a way. So for example, think back to the other class where we talked about things like overreaching and then tapering. So we manipulate the training in such a way that we reduce the volume as we get close to competition so that their fitness stays high, because we're going to maintain the intensity while reducing the volume. So their fitness stays high, and then the fatigue will drop off, and hopefully then that'll facilitate an improvement in their preparedness, and then they'll have a really good competition when they go out there. So that's the last of the three theories that underlie periodization. Like I said, generally people point to the general adaptation syndrome as being kind of the underlying theory. This one's similar, and then we also have the fitness fatigue theory. I think the author of this one, Hoff, actually was one of the co-authors on this fitness fatigue paradigm, so he seems to favor this particular paradigm because he helped write it, in my recollection. So anyway, that's the idea behind that one. All right, and here's where the frustration begins. So remember, these terms move around some. So in this textbook, for the NSCA, and I guess that's all that really matters here, because this textbook is the basis for the NSCA exam, for the CSCS exam. So be familiar with this terminology scheme with respect to macro, meso, and microcycles. So the macro cycle is typically an entire training year, which is how I used it in 345. But the macro cycle, as you can see there, may be up to 4 years for Olympic athletes. You may have 2 macro cycles in a year for athletes that compete fall, spring. So for example, indoor versus outdoor track, you may have separate macro cycles for each, or the same kind of thing with tennis and I think golf, where you have like an individual season one semester and then a team season the other semester. So they may have 2 macro cycles. But in general, a macro cycle is 1 year, because most of our teams, so if we think about things like football, basketball, soccer, lacrosse, hockey, etc., most of our teams just have 1 season for competition. And so with that, you only have this 1 training year period, and then the macro cycles build on each other. So the sophomore year or second year cycle builds on the first year cycle, kind of a thing. Mesocycles, so in this definition, typically several weeks to several months. So oftentimes mesocycles, if I were designing a program, would be 4 weeks, because it's just easier to do months from my standpoint. They can be longer. Related to the length of a mesocycle, remember that if you have one particular training stimulus, if we keep the load the same, they've maximized their adaptations to that load within about 4 weeks. So certainly every 4 weeks at least you want to change something. But you could, within the mesocycle, you're going to have some variation. And so the mesocycle could focus on hypertrophy, for example, for maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks potentially. But oftentimes, like I said, they'll be 4. Because, like I said, I think it's easier. Microcycles, typically a week, but in this case, they're going to say typically 4 weeks, but it can be as short as several days depending on the program. So the way that this schema is set up, so the macrocycle is the year, the mesocycle is typically a few months, and then the microcycle is typically a month, and then you have your daily training that falls within that. Here's a handy little graphic that says the same thing. So you got our multi-year plan. For our Olympic-style athletes, or maybe even for our collegiate athletes, if we want them to qualify for nationals their senior year, maybe we have a 4-year plan for them. We have our annual training plan, which again, oftentimes is synonymous with the macro cycle, especially if we're talking about, like I said, team sport athletes like football, baseball, etc. Those two are usually the same thing. Mesocycle, 2 to 6 weeks, but apparently can be several months. And then the microcycle, see, that's the funny thing here. All right, several days to 2 weeks. This one says typically 4. So even within their own slideshow, the numbers move around a little bit, which, like I said, point of frustration for me. It'd be nice if we standardize the terms a little bit. Nonetheless, there's a little table that says similar things. Training day, 1 day. Training session, several hours. So that's I'm going to go work out today. That's my training session. And so typically, training day and training session are the same thing unless you have multiple sessions. So unless they have, like an easy run in the morning, thinking of a cross-country runner, and then they're going to do some intervals in the afternoon. So their training day would, in that case, include 2 separate sessions. But for the most part, most of our athletes are only going to train once a day. So those two go together. All right, periodization periods. Here's another thing where they move around some. So remember that in 345, the way that it was laid out is that there was the big phases were the preparation phase and the competition phase, and then they had some terminology for like a post-competition phase or a transition. So there were like 3 big phases or periods. And then within the preparation phase, remember that was broken down into general preparation and then specific preparation. And then for the competition phase, we had pre-competition and then main competitive phase. So in this graphic, first transition is the same thing as the pre-competition phase. So it is kind of like, if we're thinking about football, then, or even something like soccer at the collegiate level, then the first transition or the pre-competitive phase is like training camp. So that month, prior to the first real games being played, that would be part of the first transition. And then the non-conference games would be also part of the pre-competitive phase, because what matters for the most part is winning your conference championship, because that's what automatically gets you in the playoffs, right? So using that basic logic, then the first transition phase includes both camp and non-conference. Main competitive phase is conference games, and then hopefully you get to the playoffs. And then the second transition phase is the off season, but that would, in this context, second transition is that recovery phase. So typically, we don't want second transition to last any more than 4 weeks, because if they take too much time away from training, then you're going to have to increase the length of the preparation phase. So usually the second transition phase is 2 to 4 weeks. So just know that first transition phase here is the same thing as the pre-competitive phase that we talked about in the other class. So in terms of training load, so what you can see here, and the basic relationship in periodization is that as the intensity of the training increases, the volume of the training decreases, and if we account for total load, that also includes technique training. So you get this increase in technique as we get closer to the season. So if it's somebody like a softball pitcher, she's working on her pitching technique more and more as we move closer into the main competitive phase. And at the same time, the intensity of her training is picking up. So she's doing more sprinting, more high velocity throwing, more heavy weightlifting, those kinds of things, but at a reduced volume. So she's not doing as much of them, but she's doing them at a higher intensity. That's the basic relationship. So as intensity goes up, volume goes down. As technique training goes up, volume goes down. So preparatory period can be thought of as the off season. So like I said, if, again, thinking in the context, let's use basketball this time. So basketball, the competitive phase is basically from October to March, thinking of collegiate basketball. So then through, let's say, the second week of March, or maybe even the entire month of April. So just those 4 weeks of April, that'll be our second transition phase for these athletes, where they get their 4 weeks away from the gym. We don't want them shooting. We don't want them, doing any basketball type training. We want them to just be away from the sport for a little bit. Doesn't mean that they're inactive. They can go and do, bicycle riding or light jogging or light lifting, those kinds of things. But we just want them away from basketball enough and doing enough different activities that they allow themselves to recover both physically and mentally. And then once we get to May, now we enter this preparatory period. And so we're going to start by entering the general preparatory period. And so the idea behind the general preparatory period is that we're going to lay the foundation for their future training. So I'm trying to remember where my slideshow. Okay, good. It goes where I thought it went. I looked through it before I started talking, and then I forgot what was next. All right. So in the general preparatory period then, we're going to have our basic strength phase. So these are, 6 weeks, maybe 8 to 12 weeks, where we're going to have the athletes do moderate intensity, maybe low intensity training, but eventually progressing to moderate intensity training with relatively high volumes. So you can see there they're going to do 50 to 75% of their 1 rep max, 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 20 repetitions. Obviously, if you're doing 20 reps, you're doing more like 50% of your 1 rep max. If you're doing 8 reps, you're doing more like 75% of your 1 rep max. So again, the idea with this general preparatory phase is to sort of lay that physiological foundation. So for our strength and power athletes, we're trying to make them bigger, we're trying to make them stronger. For our endurance athletes, what we're trying to do is to lay that aerobic base for them so that they get more capillaries, more mitochondria, higher plasma volume, those kinds of things. And so capillaries and mitochondria in the trained muscle cells. And try to get that aerobic capacity back up, try to get that lactate threshold back up after the layoff. So that's what's happening during that general preparatory period. Then we move on to the specific preparatory period, which here is the basic strength phase. So specific prep and basic strength in this context mean the same thing. So specific preparatory, remember what we're doing is we're making the exercises increasingly similar to what the athlete is going to do in the sport. So increasingly similar with respect to the type of movement, also increasingly similar with respect to the velocity of movement. So you can see that we've increased the intensity, so now we're lifting heavier weights, and then they're doing 2 to 6 sets of 2 to 6 reps. So they're lifting fairly heavy weights, 80 to 90% or 95% of their 1 rep max, for the same basic volume, maybe a little bit lower. So rather than having them do like leg press, for example, which is something you might use during the general preparatory phase, now we move to squats. And then maybe we move to front squats. And then maybe we move to one-legged squats because they're a soccer athlete, because this guy's a soccer player in the picture. They're a soccer athlete, and so we want, because so much of what they do is in single leg stance, we want to do a bunch of training in single leg stance, right? And so we get more specific in that way. So that's what's going to happen in the basic strength phase. And then we move into the first transition period, which again is that pre-competitive phase. So now they're starting to practice their sport. They're probably decreasing their time in the weight room. So maybe not necessarily their overall time, but or their time per session, but they're rather than lifting 4 days a week, now they're lifting maybe 3 days a week, or maybe as few as 2. So that's going to happen during this first transition period. So one of the things you can see here, which might be confusing, is that they're going to use low to very high loads, quite the range. So where they're going with this is that now we're starting to move at the speed of sport. So we're going to have them do really explosive things. And so what we're going to do with really explosive type movements is we can either have them lift really light weights, so 30% of the 1 rep max, and move it very fast, or we can have them lift really heavy weights. So think about things like power cleans or push jerks or any of the other Olympic variants, snatch pulls, whatever you want to do. But we have them lift as heavy as possible, or pretty close to it, and move the weight as fast as possible. So what we're trying to do then is to increase muscular power, either move a light weight really fast or a heavy weight as fast as you can. The important thing is the intent to move quickly, because that affects that motor unit recruitment. So the idea is the intent there. So with a really heavy weight, obviously you don't move fast, but you're trying to do some explosive things with it. And so that is what's going to facilitate that motor unit recruitment that we're going for. Lower volume, so 2 to 5 sets, and then 2 to 5 reps. So, and then we're going to progress into the competitive phase. And so in the competitive phase, all we're trying to do is not lose the gains that they've made. And so typically there, if we're trying to maintain, we're only going to do 1 to 3 sets, really heavy. So low volume here, 1 to 3 sets, high intensity, really heavy weight, relatively few sets. And so you can go a little bit lower intensity here and a little bit higher volume for maintenance. I was going to say, typically what you're going to see with this is this kind of thing on the maintenance down here. If you're only lifting 1 day a week, maybe they're doing 3-4 sets, and then in this repetition range, and maybe you do like talking about periodization models as we're about to, like the idea of undulating periodization. Maybe one week you have them do up here, 1 to 3 reps, and then another week you have them do more like 5. So you could do something like that as well. All right, the off season. So, so what they're doing here is on this, not this slide, on this slide. What they're doing here is they're linking the phases that we just went through to common terminology around sports. So thinking of the off season as the preparatory phase. So basically the general and specific preparatory. And then the preseason is that first transition period, or the pre-competitive phase, to use the terminology that they used in the Bomba book. In season is the main competitive phase, and then postseason is that second transition phase, where they get, like I said, about a month to rest. Same concept here, so you can see the different terminology kind of juxtaposed to each other here, if that's helpful for you. So that's in that graphic. And then this table also does some really helpful stuff. So it uses some of the terminology that we've used, so general preparatory, specific preparatory, pre-competitive, main competitive, post-competitive. So this is all the top line here, or the top row. That terminology is what we used in 345. And then you can see the things that line up with that in terms of 50 to 75% 1 rep max, 3 to 6 sets, 8 to 20 reps. So when you're designing your own programs for the end of this class, remember you got to design 2 years worth of programs, what I'd like to see you do is to lay out the competition year. So if it's somebody like a volleyball player, for example, and you say, okay, the competitive season runs from, let's say, August to mid-November. And then beyond that, they start second transition. They do that till, I don't know, early December. Maybe and they're going to lose some fitness here, but maybe as late as early January. And then we start the preparatory phase. They're in general preparatory for several months. Then they move to specific, and then they move to for the pre-competitive phase as they come back to school. So July-ish. And then in drawing that program up, now that you've got it outlined in terms of general versus specific preparatory and when those happen on the calendar, now you know where they need to exercise in terms of their strength training. So 50 to 75% of their 1 rep max, 3 to 6 sets, 8 to 20 reps. And so one of the ways that you could progress that is to say, okay, they're going to do 3 sets of 20 reps at 50% of the 1 rep max this week. 3 weeks from now or 2 weeks from now, they're going to do 3 sets at 55%, 18 reps, something like that. And so you're decreasing the volume and increasing the intensity, kind of working your way through it like that. So, like I said, really helpful little chart here. But it includes other terminology, so off-season, preseason, in-season, and then the hypertrophy, basic strength, strength, power, and peaking. So just these top 3 rows are all the different types of terminology you could use. But like I said, throughout 345, we use the top line, or the top row. We talked about these as well. So linear periodization is, like I said in the other class, the model that I tend to default to because it's the one that I'm most familiar with, and it's pretty simple and works pretty well. But with linear periodization, sorry, head yawned. Okay, there we go. All right, we're back. So linear periodization, the basic schema would be kind of like I was laying out on the last slide, where let's say you're doing 3 sets of 12 repetitions for these 2 weeks, then on the 3rd week, you're going to do 3 sets of 10 repetitions. So obviously, as you decrease the number of reps, the load goes up. You have them lift more weight. And then we do that for 2 weeks. Then we drop to 8s, then 6s, then 4s, then 2s, then you max out, right? That's linear periodization. And then undulating or nonlinear periodization would be like we do, let's say, power on Monday. So we have them do really heavy weights, so pretty close to max weight on power cleans. We have them do 3 repetitions or less, and we have them do, let's say, 4 sets. Then on Wednesday, we're going to do a hypertrophy day. So rather than doing 3 sets of 3, we're going to have them do 4 sets of 12 with more like 60% of their 1 rep max. So we're trying to induce muscle growth there. And then on Friday, we have a strength day, and so we have them do 4 sets of 5 at 80% of the 1 rep max or something like that. So that's undulating periodization. So we're doing power Monday, hypertrophy Wednesday, and then strength on Friday. Doesn't have to be in that order, but that's the idea, is that you're undulating, going up and down with the load of their program. So primarily through manipulating intensity the way that I laid it out. So that's non-linear periodization. You can also do it by week. So this week's going to be hypertrophy week, next week's going to be power week, following week's going to be a strength week, that kind of a thing. So this stuff I'm not going to go through with you, but it is, I put these all in the slideshow in case you don't have the book. So this is all the stuff, it's a program for a female college basketball player, and so it goes through all the different parts of the season, but it also includes individual workouts. So this is kind of what I would like your program to look like at the end of the semester. So I put all these graphics on there so that you can see what they look like, so you have a good model for your own programming at the end of the semester. So you can see all those. And like I said, this is up in Canvas, so certainly feel free to download it because I'm just kind of clicking through, but all this is there for you. And that's it for periodization. Like I said, we covered it in much more detail in the other class, but hopefully that brings back some or jogs your memory a little bit and helps you recall what we talked about in that class. Next time, we're moving on to rehabilitation and reconditioning, which is chapter 22. So we'll see you then.